Welcome, everyone. This is the Age and Dementia-Friendly Pioneer Valley quarterly meeting. We've been meeting for a couple of years now on the various aspects of age and dementia-friendly communities. And so today we're talking about buildings and outdoor spaces. And if you haven't done so already, please put your name and organization or town in the chat. So I'm going to give a short introduction or a short overview of the project, and then we have three speakers today. We have Chris Wante from EDM talking about building interiors, and using universal design. And Chris has designed the Hadley Senior Center and the South Hadley Senior Center, so he'll talk a little bit about that. Then we have Melissa Marshall talking about ADA transition plans and disaster preparation for people with disabilities. And Melissa developed the ADA transition plan for Northampton. So Keith Benoit is the ADA planner for Northampton. So he'll talk a little about how that plan's being implemented. And then we have Andrew Kilduff talking about the Belchertown Sensory Trail. Andrew was the designer on that trail, and Doug Albertson from Belchertown will talk a little about where that trail is now in terms of the construction. So the presentations will go till about 11:10, and then we have about 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion and some announcements. And then from 11:30 to 12, that's an optional time where if people who are working on age and dementia-friendly designation or implementation, we have time to talk. And also I'll talk a little bit more about applying for regional designation and what that will look like in the coming year. So we've been looking at different aspects of age and dementia-friendly communities based on this model from the Massachusetts Healthy Aging Collaborative, which combines the 8 domains of livability that was developed by the World Health Organization and 10 domains of a dementia-friendly community. It sort of combined everything into 9 domain areas. And so again, today we're talking about outdoor spaces and buildings. And some of you have seen this sort of overview of the importance of buildings and outdoor spaces for older adults. So there will be places to gather both inside and out. And as we know, outside spaces have been really important during the pandemic. So buildings are accessible and have parking for wheelchair users. We use of universal design principles is important. So designing for all users from the beginning without having to amend or add wheelchair ramps later. Parks have benches and smooth pathways for people using wheelchairs or walkers. Access to handicap and accessible restrooms are in key locations, and parks and sidewalks are safe and well lit. And our speakers today will go into a lot more detail, and I'm sure I've left a lot of things out of this sort of general overview, but that's why they're here. So with that, I'm going to share some resources later. This is a checklist that was developed by Age Strong Boston and has some good things for consideration for buildings and outdoor buildings, but I will share more resources later. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Chris Wante from EDM. Chris, are you all ready with a presentation?
I am.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Becky. I'm going to share my screen and see if I can get this thing to work correctly. How does that look? Can you see my
That looks good.
shining face here? Okay, cool. So let me just fix this here. So thanks, Becky. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Wante. I'm an associate principal and architect with EDM. We're an architecture and engineering firm in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Becky obviously asked me here today to talk to you guys about universal design, and specifically universal design for interior spaces. I just wanted to throw my contact info up on the screen here in case anybody wanted to follow up with me on anything that we talk about today. We'll obviously have some time at the end of this for questions, but in case people don't get a chance to ask their questions, you can certainly reach out to me. I'd be glad to talk to you guys about, universal design in particular. So I wanted to start with just a quick definition of universal design, and just kind of reading from the sheet here. It's at its core, universal design is the design of spaces, products, or environments to make them accessible to all people, regardless of age, size, or abilities. So the key words there are all people. One of the biggest misconceptions with universal design, it's tailored for folks with specific disadvantages. But universal design is really meant to work for people of all ages and all abilities. Some are younger, some are older, some with temporary disabilities, some with permanent challenges. And right now, the only standard that most designers hold themselves to is, the ADA guidelines, which is great, kind of as a minimum standard, but the ADA doesn't really work to serve the entire population. So universal design kind of picks up where the ADA leaves off and, tries to tie together all people of all ages and sizes and abilities. Universal design is broken down into 7 different principles, and just kind of breezing through these really quick. First principle is equitable use. This just means that spaces are meant to be useful for people with diverse abilities, essentially making the space usable by everybody, trying to exclude no one. Flexibility in use. So, people have different needs and preferences for the space. So this principle was created thinking about designing flexible rooms and different spaces that could bring multiple options in the way that they're used and accommodate folks that have different needs. Principle 3, simple and intuitive use. This one basically is trying to state that, the use of the space is easy to understand, regardless of people's experiences, knowledge levels, language, concentration level, cognitive level, make it really easy to understand. Perceptible information, this one's all about communication. And in terms of design, the space itself needs to communicate, the necessary information effectively to the people that are actually using the space. Tolerance for error. This one means, design should really try to minimize risks as much as possible and try to limit possible accidents from happening within the space, or, how users are interacting with the space and the elements within the space. Low physical effort. People really shouldn't have to struggle to open the door or getting up from a chair, that's designed too low. Countertop that's designed too high. It really should be, the space should really be comfortable to use and really use a minimum amount of effort to use the space. And then principle 7, the last one here, size and space for approach and use. This one is similar to principle 7. That's all about making it easier for the folks to access different components of the building. Trying to design the appropriate space for things like a person's approach, their reach, their manipulation level, the use of the space, regardless of their body size, short, tall, their posture, or their mobility. So that's just a quick overview of the 7 different principles. And what I'd like to do is kind of take you through the 7 principles and show you guys some examples of things that we've done in the area. We've been lucky enough to work with some of the folks in the Pioneer Valley area, and I actually see some friendly faces that we've worked with, Leslie over at South Hadley, Haley and Hadley and Lee down in Chicopee. So good to see you guys. But so I wanted to zip through some photos here and just explain some things that we like to do and how they affect the space. So the first category, equitable use. I know we said we were going to be focusing on interiors here, so I'm kind of cheating a little bit, but this is a view of the Hadley Senior Center, which some of you might be familiar with. But the idea with the space surrounding a building is that it really needs to be able to be used by all different folks. We want no curbs, no stepping of any type throughout the entire parking lot. Minimum trip hazards, trying to have as little textural change as possible. So, even the crosswalks that you see are it's all painted. They're not meant to have any indentations for people with walkers or people with, unsure footing. It wants to be as seamless as possible for the pedestrian to get from the parking area to the front door. We like to design in sidewalks at the head end of all parking spaces, again, to make it safe and easy to get from your parking space to the front door. We don't like people walking, in between the drive aisles to get to the building. We want it to be a clear and easy path to get from the parking area to the building. covered drop off for folks that, might need a minute, between when they get dropped off to get into the building. A little bit of cover from the elements, lighted bollards out front to help people when it gets towards dusk. It just helps people understand kind of where the main entry is and how to get from, point A to point B. And I mentioned kind of the large crosswalk there going from the parking area to the front door, really making it obvious for folks where they need to go and where they need to cross, just to make it safe and easy to understand. Flexibility in use. A couple of examples of this is we try to advocate for hearing loops or induction loops installed in, large gathering and activity spaces. There's a stigma sometimes of some folks to, that have hearing disabilities to ask, the staff for, a special headset or a special assisted listening device, to hear what's going on. So it's just really nice and helpful for those people just to be able to, if they have a hearing aid, just kind of tune in their hearing aid to what's going on in the space and not have to, ask for special assistance. It's just kind of there for them to use the space in an easy way. Grab bars and toilet stalls. We like to, not just handicap accessible stalls. We like to put grab bars in all stalls, and we put them on both sides at an angle to help folks with, different arm reach or different strength to be able to, if they need help getting up, they can be able to, get that little bit of assistance that they might need. So that's just a way, again, making it really flexible for all different types of people to use the restroom areas. Simple and intuitive use. This is the South Hadley Senior Center. This is the floor plan. This is one of our things that we like to try to accomplish within a building as far as the circulation within a building. We don't get to do this all the time, but here we're able to design in this racetrack circulation concept that we like to call. And it really is just trying to make it as easy as possible for folks to understand how to circulate around within a building. We don't like to do dead end corridors. We don't like to make long corridors that are complicated and, hard to understand. We want it to be the beginning is also the end. People with cognitive disabilities, people can get disoriented very easily. This type of design and circulation within a building just makes it very, very easy to understand and very difficult to get lost or get disoriented in. So it's something that we like to try to design into our buildings just to help the users understand really simple and really easily how to use the space and how to get around the space. Perceptible information. This is a photo of the interior of the Chicopee or the River Mills Senior Center in Chicopee. The conveying and communicating the spaces and how the space is used is really important in the design of a building. We advocate for single story buildings wherever possible, but in a 2-story setting, it's really important for us to convey to the users that there are 2 stories and that there are things happening on multiple levels. We don't want there to be a case where there's a staircase, buried in the corners of the building where, you walk into a building and you don't really know that there's anything happening above or below you. We want it to be very obvious that there's things happening on multiple levels, make it very easy for people to identify how to get from point A to point B, when we're talking vertical circulation. So, large openings in the floors, large lights to cue you as to where you need to go down to the lower level or upper level or vice versa. So, just again, conveying and communicating the information of the overall design of the building with, using these architectural elements. Tolerance for error. So this one is, like I said, about minimizing risks. So this is just a photo of a front door that we like to design, large automatic sliding doors for people of different shapes and sizes, very easy to navigate, multiple lanes of traffic can get in and out easily. The walk-off carpet that you see on the ground is not confined to just the vestibule area. We like to extend it into the lobby area in front of the reception desk and beyond if we can. That just limits, folks tracking in mud and water and, other stuff from there, travels outside and, getting stuff on the floor and, just causing potentials for slipping and Also, it kind of removes the need for those kind of throw down mats that you see everywhere that, can be a tripping hazard if people catch their foot on them. So that's just another reason for extending this kind of durable carpet that we call walk-off mat into the space and beyond the vestibule. No thresholds everywhere, throughout the entire building, just like we talked about on the exterior, no curbs. But also when you get inside the building, there's no thresholds. The transition from carpet to tile to concrete to, porcelain tile, all of the thresholds are completely flush. There's no, trying to limit the amount of trip hazards in the building as much as possible. If we need to recess part of the slab in order to get the material to be flush with the adjacent materials, then that's what we do. So, the idea is that there is a completely flat surface throughout the entirety of the site and the building. Low physical effort. This is a photo of the interior of the Hadley Senior Center. So what I wanted to point out here was just kind of the, in the event that we can't do a racetrack design for the circulation, we do need corridors. This is an example of what we would like to do where, oversized corridors fit multiple lanes of traffic going up and down. We have handrails going down the entire corridor that are designed into the architecture. There are contrasting material, color and material so folks can easily find it. And if they need assistance getting down the, longer hallways, they have the space there. But if somebody does need a break down the hallway, it's not blocking traffic. You can still get multiple people by it, or somebody in a wheelchair, somebody in a walker can easily, navigate around folks that are stopping for a second to catch their breath. Same thing with benches, along the way. We want to make it very easy and comfortable for people to circulate around the building. So, if there needs to be a place for folks to sit and rest for a minute, on their way from the classroom over to the billiards room, or from the lobby to the exercise suite, there are spaces along the way that we like to design into the corridors to be able to, find that little bit of a rest. And then this is just a really simple one that we like to do, but we like to specify these rocker style switches. Again, making it really simple for folks to use, make it comfortable. Just, and people with different types of manipulation abilities can easily, hit the button. I know that the toggle switch isn't, the end of the world, but somebody who, finds it difficult to grip things, this is just a much easier switch to handle. And we try to specify it wherever we can, again, just to, reduce that physical effort where possible. And then the last one, size and space for approach and use. This is, again, I keep showing you guys Hadley, but this is the Hadley Senior Center. This is the main entry and lounge space. The reception area is immediately accessible, right off the entry door, which is, a fairly obvious thing to do, but there's different heights of the reception desk. There's a lower height, there's an upper height, and then an even lower height for people with wheelchairs to pull up to. So, creating the different uses within the reception area just makes it easy for different folks to use the different spaces. You can kind of see good clearances around all of the furniture. We're not trying to cram in sofas and chairs and tables. There's plenty of space to be able to circulate around, each individual chair and each individual table. Again, just, designing the space appropriately for, that extra needed space for, again, folks in wheelchairs and folks in walkers. You don't want to try to make it difficult for them to use the space. So creating that extra clearance around is very important. And then just, another thing to point out here is lighting levels. Lighting levels is really important. And, the senior center design, and there's guidelines throughout the industry of lighting levels, but we always go above and beyond the minimum requirements. Again, just like the ADA things, we like to go above and beyond the requirements. So we want to make it bright with the daylighting, but also with the ambient lighting as much as possible for folks that might have a little bit of a visual impairment to, be able to see what's going on in front of them and, handle that activity. That's that task there, whether you're in the lounge or you're in a classroom or you're in the exercise room. We always, design to the highest standard for lighting levels. So those are the 7 principles. I just wanted to touch on some miscellaneous examples that you guys might be interested in. So we spend way too much time designing our bathrooms and making sure that they function appropriately. One example here is just the sink area. Touchless devices is really important. so you're not having to grip anything, but also, something as simple as just making sure that the trash and the paper towels are right within reach of the sink that you're at. The worst thing is when you're washing your hands and you have to look for the paper towel dispenser and you've got to go behind you, you walk across the floor with wet hands and they drip on the floor, and then, that's a slipping hazard. So we want to keep everything close to the sinks to reduce that possibility. Contrasting toilet seat covers we try to do. Again, people that might have a visual impairment, if the toilet's white and the floor is white and the walls are white, it might be difficult to kind of find where you need to sit. So, just making it very, very obvious that, the contrasting black on the white toilet makes it very easy for folks to identify where they need to go. Airport style restrooms, we like to do, again, just making it easy for folks to navigate in and out of restrooms, not having to have them open a door or, try to, they get bonked by the door if they're coming out and somebody's leaving, or, vice versa. So airport style, we try to design it as best we can to the larger facilities within these senior centers. And then just kind of redundant signage and, making it obvious where people need to go when they're using the restrooms. And then some just quick no-nos that we like to stay away from. There's this trend within design to, paint the doors the same color as the walls, and it's just not great for folks who have, might have a cognitive disability or, visual impairment. They're trying to find the room. It's just not a great design. So, it's obviously a no-no. Same thing with the stairs. If you have to have stairs, you want there to be contrasting colors between the treads and the risers so that folks know exactly where to put their foot when they're walking down or up the stairs. And then avoiding, potentially disorienting or uncomfortable patterns. Again, people with cognitive disabilities could get easily, disturbed by having to walk down a hallway like this. So we try to avoid, the anxiety that might come with somebody trying to encounter a corridor that has a very funky pattern on the ground and just, feeling uncomfortable about walking down a corridor like that. And then just a quick little anecdote I like to share, regarding universal design. It's not just about buildings. It weaves its way into every aspect of our life. And there's this gentleman by the name of Sam Barber. He grew up in the world of kitchen appliances and, made his money designing kitchen appliances in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And he retired, was hanging out with his wife a lot, and they had a lot of spare time. And his wife actually suffered from arthritis. And she had been struggling with this vegetable peeler that they had in their house. And, conventional kitchen appliances back in the day they were designed in such a way that made it very difficult for folks that had arthritis or people who had problems gripping things, able to use them. So she went to her husband and was complaining, and they decided together as a team to, create this line of kitchen utensils that would be easily used, easily understood, good materials. So they created this company called OXO Good Grips in the 90s, and it was designed in a way for folks that potentially had arthritis or people that needed to have a easier or more easily usable kitchen appliances. And, 30, 40 years later, they're, one of the biggest kitchen appliance brands or kitchen utensil brands in the country. And it's specifically because they designed their devices to, be easily understood, be intuitive, be elegant, but work. They're functional. That's the reason why everybody wants to use them, not just folks that might have a disability, but everybody wants to use them. Before I even heard the story, I had, numerous OXO Good Grips, things in my house. So it's just a good universal design success story that I like to share. And just to show you that it's not just about buildings, but it kind of weaves its way into every aspect of our life. So that's my spiel, and I'll relinquish the screen, and hopefully I didn't go over my 15 minutes.
Thanks, Chris. Just about right. Yeah, and just speaking of everyday things, there was a conference a few years ago with the guy who started the age-friendly movement in Springfield, or he started it worldwide, and he came to Springfield and talked about the parking meters. Are they easy for people to use? So it really gets into some detail. So next we have Melissa Marshall, and Melissa, you can say what your organization is, but I'm going to pull up your slides now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I work with the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, and I live in West Hartford, Connecticut, and our organization is all virtual, but we're based out of our co-executive directors live in Philadelphia. But the Valley is near and dear to me. I'm a Hampshire College graduate, as is my oldest son. So I spent much time in the Valley. And so we're going to talk about inclusive disaster management around disasters. And we're also going to talk about transition plans. And Becky is kind enough to offer to switch the slides for me because it's a little tricky for me to do. I use a stylus on a screen. I have cerebral palsy and I'm a wheelchair user. So I've been doing disability rights work all my professional life. And since I was a teenager, really. And 5 years ago, I got into doing disaster work for people with disabilities, but I've spent a lot of my career working in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So next slide, please. So the partnership is the only disability-led organization in the United States with a focused mission on equity for people with disabilities and people with access and functional needs throughout all planning, programs, and services and procedures before, during, and after disasters and emergencies. Next, please. So these are fast facts, not fun facts. Disabled people are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be injured in a disaster or emergency than non-disabled people. And that's a statistic from the United Nations, credible organization. And after a natural disaster, white people accumulate more wealth. Residents of color accumulate less wealth. So we see disproportionate impact on people with disabilities, disproportionate impact on people of color. And you put those together and you get double disproportionate impact. And guess what? People who are older are more likely to be injured and die in disasters as well. Next, please. People with multiple marginalized identity are disproportionate impact in disasters. So if I'm someone who is, if I'm someone who's Black, I'm someone who's a woman, I'm someone who's a Black woman, I'm more likely to be disproportionately impacted by disaster if I have a disability and all of those things. So it's compounded depression, it's marginalized identities, it's intersectionality, it's all of those things that happen together. Next, please. Thank you. So I want to look at some Western Mass disasters and emergencies because you might be thinking it can't happen here because pretty much everyone thinks, lots of people think it can't happen here. You receive flooding, severe winter weather, extreme heat, power outages, earthquakes, emergency disasters and diseases and pandemics. We all know about that. Water supply emergencies, hazardous materials, forest fires, and tornadoes and high winds. Next, please. So I want to talk about disabled people being disproportionately impacted from disasters. It's because of lack of access. That might be communication. They can't get in touch. There isn't a sign language interpreter available. There isn't video relay interpreting. There's structural barriers that people encountered. There's lack of access to resources before, during, and after disasters. Our socioeconomic, people with disabilities tend to be poor and tend to be a large percentage of the older adult population. And people with disabilities and access requirements are often an afterthought. And I wish everyone designed like Chris. I just want to say that's a great building. I know you have an 860 area code, so you're Connecticut based. I wish everyone designed like you. If you come away from this presentation with anything, one of the things I want you to come away with is civil rights are not waived during disasters or emergencies. Because people say, oh, it's great you have the right to an interpreter. It's great you have a right to accessible building. It's great you have a right to signage, but it's a disaster, so we can't do it. No, that's when our rights are the most important to us and they're not suspended or waived despite what people might say about that or think about that. Next, please. I want to talk quickly about, there's a lawyer that lives inside me. I don't practice law, but I am a lawyer. Some laws that protect people with disabilities are the Americans with Disabilities Act that Chris referred to. And it applies to state and local governments. It also applies to public spaces, and we're not going to talk about that a lot, but to public spaces like movie theaters, those kinds of private facilities, shopping malls, doctors' offices, et cetera. And the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It applies to anyone who gets any federal funding. So if you have any federal funding, you have all the obligations under the Rehab Act of 1973. Both of those protect the rights of people with disabilities, including during disasters. The ADA obligations. Now, these aren't obligations just during disasters. These are obligations you have all the time. You have the obligation conduct a self-evaluation that assesses your employment policies and practices. Do they inadvertently discriminate against people with disabilities? Do you provide equally effective communication to people with speech, hearing, and visual disabilities? Overall non-discrimination obligations, do you meet them? Do you have any discriminatory eligibility criteria? Again, inadvertently, nobody sits down and says, I'm going to discriminate against people with disabilities to my eligibility criteria. Do you modify your policies as you need to? And are your programs and facilities accessible to people with disabilities? So that's what you need to do for your self-evaluation. And everyone needs to do this all the time. This applies during disasters. It has to be done, but it should be done well before disasters and really is totally separate from disasters. Next, please. You need to develop a transition plan, which is one of my topics. And I just want to correct Becky. I did not write the City of Northampton's ADA transition plan. I wrote policy recommendations for it, which are in Appendix D. So I didn't do the whole thing. So I don't get any of the credit or any of the blame. You need to develop, you must develop, this has been due since like 1991, a transition plan that delineates which structural barriers you're going to remove. Because not all barriers have to be removed in existing construction. So if it's built before 1991, it doesn't have to be accessible as long as your programs and services are accessible. So you've got to pick which buildings you're going to remove barriers in, which outdoor spaces you're going to remove barriers in, when they'll be removed by with a date attached to them, and who will be responsible for that barrier removal. Okay, next, please. Now, how do you figure out what barriers you're going to remove? You get a ton of barriers. Well, first of all, lots of buildings have been built since the early 1990s, so those have to be accessible, no ifs, ands, or buts, so you don't need to worry about that. So it's easier than it was in 1990 when I first started doing this. Yes, I'm dating myself. But you want to include people with disabilities, including disabled people who have multiply marginalized identities. In other words, people of color, people experiencing poverty, people experiencing homelessness, people from queer communities. You want to include multiply marginalized populations and ask some people whose first language isn't English. And after you do that, you involve people with disabilities all along. You want to conduct a structural audit. That needs to be done by access audit professionals. It can be people with disabilities. I used to do access audits. Last time I did access audits was right before the pandemic. I do school systems, I've done municipalities, I've done towns, but you want professionals who know how to do it. These can be professionals with or without disabilities. Just because somebody has a disability and uses a wheelchair doesn't mean they know anything about what's required under the code. And one of the experts I work with is somebody who doesn't happen to have a disability, that she's someone who's older than me and someone who learned under me. And so you don't have to have a disability. What you have to have is someone, they don't have to be an architect, no offense. They have to be someone who knows how to conduct an access audit. If I'm doing design elements in a building, of course, I bring in an architect, we bring in an architect, but you have to have professionals. They have to know what they're doing. People say, oh, I use a wheelchair, I can get in. And I'll say to people when I'm training, I don't care. They'll say, I use a wheelchair and I can't get in. I'll say, I don't care. What I care about is, does it comply with code or does it meet universal design principles? If that's what we're designing for, that's what we're auditing for. You also must have a curb cut plan. So that's really critical as well. And you've got to look at your curb cuts. Which ones are we going to remove? When are we going to do it by? We need to remove them all, but you want to start from the most important areas to your city hall, which you've done, to more peripheral areas, to residential areas. Work your way out unless it gets requested that a curb cut is in a certain area. Again, these are requirements for everyone. Don't have to do with the disasters, have to do a transition plan. Next, please. No, the draft plan, I didn't say should, I said can be submitted with input from the disability community to help set priorities. I didn't want to say should because I didn't want to imply that was legally required. And I could do a day-long presentation on transition plans if you'd let me. I have a 5-day training on ADA obligations, but you've been spared that. You only get me for a few minutes. And Becky's job is to tell me to stop when it's time to stop, or tell me to slow down when it's time to slow down. So the draft plan can be submitted with input from the disability community. We recommend that to help submit priority. So you have, hey, here's the barriers we're thinking about moving. Have a public hearing, give people input, give people a draft before the public hearing, let them comment on it. And again, all your programs and services must be accessible, but not every building has to be accessible. It's constructed prior to 1991. You could move something downstairs. You can move something to another more accessible building. If you're more than one library, you can move it to the accessible library as long as they're within a reasonable geographic proximity. And again, transition plans have been legally required since 1991, so they're really not new. So if you want to get going on it, you can start today, is the good news. Next, please. So congratulations to Northampton. You've made great strides in these, and you've even addressed disaster in your transition plan. So great for you guys. And I don't take credit for that. I just take credit for the small addendum portion. Next, please. So let's talk for a few minutes about what happens to people with disabilities and disasters. We get left behind, our needs get ignored, and we get institutionalized in nursing and other facilities when we don't need to be. Next, please. Disabled people end up in institutions during disasters. When people go to nursing facilities and other institutions, they lose their independence. They lose their social networks. Often they lose their jobs. They lose their homes. People in institutions can get lost. They can get sick, and they die at earlier ages. And we used to make this argument. I wrote a paper for the National Council on Disability. I wasn't the author of it. They contract out with you. They give you a grant to write it. So they wrote it, but I was responsible for a lot of the content on it. And we had to make the case that people with disabilities get sick more often in nursing facilities and congregate settings. And we, sadly, since COVID-19, we don't have to make that case anymore. It's pretty clearly understood and incontrovertible. Next, please. So what can be done to promote equity in disasters and emergencies? You want to provide training to the disability community and people with multiple marginalized identities that are also disabled, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian and Pacific Islander, queer people, older adults, people with low or no income, and people experiencing homelessness with disabilities. You want to train them in their rights during emergencies and disasters, also in their responsibilities, including preparedness planning. You want people to be prepared. You want them to do reasonable things. You can't say, save $1,000 for this because not everyone has access to do that, but you want to see what they can do to make them feel safer and more comfortable, and to be safer and more comfortable. Next, please. And what can be done? What else can be done to promote equity in disasters? Emergency and evacuation for indoor and outdoor spaces and other plans need to be created, again, with the disability community, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian and Pacific Islanders, queer people, older adults, people with low and no income, and people experiencing homelessness with disabilities. You want to make sure they're included in the emergency and evacuation plans, and these plans need to be exercised regularly. You've got to have a disaster plan even for outdoor spaces. I'm finishing up a project right now that talks about evacuating outdoor spaces and how to do that, because you can evacuate a building or space. Sometimes you need to evacuate a region. And you've got to have the input from people with disabilities, and this has to be exercised. Because even if you develop a great plan with input from the disability community, and you've included everyone from the disability community, you've done a great job on that. If it's not exercised, it's not worth the screen it's printed on. You really need to exercise those plans regularly. And we recommend a few times a year, and then you can go down to a couple times a year after you have it down pat, because that teaches people what to do. And the plan isn't to have it go perfectly. The plan is for things to break. And we do an exercise or plan. We'll put up a disaster scenario, then we'll do an inject. Somebody has a heart attack or something happens, or there's a chemical spill or this or that, because those are the things that happen in emergencies. Emergencies, by definition, don't go as they're planned. Next, please. You're good. So I want to talk to you about how to get involved in the partnership if that's something you're interested in. We have weekly stakeholder calls every Tuesday at 3 p.m. We also have daily disability COVID-19 calls, and they're each day at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And they started on February 28th, 2020, in response to the pandemic. And we decided we're going to go every night until the pandemic was under control. So we've been having these calls for over two and a half years now, 7 days a week, including major holidays. I take my husband's birthday off and Father's Day off, but those are the kinds of days that we take off. But the call has gone consecutively 365 days a year, except when it's a leap year, then we go 366 days a year. Everyone's welcome to join that call. And that's at 6 p.m. We have a Tuesday call, and that's been going on for years before the pandemic. That's every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Both those calls are around an hour. And you can contact us to learn the services that we offer, or you can visit our website. And I'm hoping that Becky can make this slide deck available to you. And basically, thank you so much for including me in the presentation today. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to talk to you about it and understand you don't always know what you don't know about disasters and emergencies. Disasters can strike anywhere, anytime. The amount of disasters is increasing dramatically with climate change. The number one killer in disasters right now, or in emergencies right now, is heat. You might think it's hurricane, you might think it's tornado, you might think it's, possible earthquakes that have happened elsewhere in the world. It's heat. And that's going to keep increasing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you, Melissa. That was very informative. Thank you so much. So we'll have, again, time for questions after all the presentations are done. Keith, did you want to say a little bit about where the Northampton ADA transition plan is now and how it's being implemented?
Thank you, Melissa. So we accepted our transition plan in 2019. I came on board in 2020. So hopefully some of these themes, there's maybe a lot of themes, maybe you can learn from them. I had a lot to learn from coming from getting my planning degree to come doing ADA work. So my job is the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG, Community Development Planner in Northampton, but also the ADA coordinator. So that was kind of the first recommendation, was to bring that from the senior center to the planning office. And I think that has a lot of benefits. One, we're in the grant writing, not just CDBG, but other grants like the MOD grant. So we have a lot of capacity for those physical infrastructure things. And the senior center, although there's a lot of overlap maybe with older adults and people with disabilities, I think having it in City Hall and being close to all the municipal buildings kind of allows, and working closer with City Council or the Mayor's office to work on different things has been very beneficial. But I see that transition plan as really kind of just a jumping off point. There's things in there identified, and as I'm kind of going a deeper dive into those things, I'm noticing different things. And so the second item was a snow removal policy. And I'm sure you all have snow removal policies, but enforcement, basically cities around the country don't do a very good job enforcing these policies. So it's on the user, the people that need the snow removal to happen, people in a wheelchair, people walking, with a walker or a cane, to call and say, hey, I can't get around the snow pile and in front of a business. So that's been a challenge, looking on how not just increasing enforcement, but is there some other way we could do that? And other things have been floated, like getting a little machine from DPW, which costs a lot of money, or, this is not a serious idea, but one idea was getting prisoners to do shoveling. That doesn't work. And so we're still working on that. We don't know how to do that yet. The other thing is just increasing the funds for doing curb cuts and sidewalk improvements with the DPW. This action item, it kind of goes well with this department, CDBG grants, although CDBG, unless you have getting into weeds here, unless you have a low, moderate income area, you can only really do curb cuts. So you have to think about all your funding that you have available and how you can fit those pieces in. We have a lot of projects going on right now, either Main Street redesign or Mass DOT. So looking at your capital improvement plan and seeing what money is coming at you and then where those missing pieces are. The other recommendation is modifications. And so the other things have been kind of physical barriers, but now these policies. So someone might need translation services or assisted listening devices, or they need a reasonable accommodation. So these policies really are, stating you have a policy, but letting people know about it. But now, how do you operationalize that? So there's a request, where do people kind of go for that? Still working on that. There's been some reprieve a little bit with COVID, and it has allowed for live transcription of the meetings. But we did get an MOD grant for assisted listening devices, and that's going to go to that went to City Hall, Senior Center, and Hearing Room. But there's still a lot of physical barriers that have been identified. So I did an analysis, and I'm putting together an MOD grant to look at the service windows and the doors. We have a lot of older buildings. The doors are too heavy. They're not automatic. And there's lift barriers getting over the threshold of the door. And the other thing was accessible parking. We do have, on paper, we have all the accessible parking we need to be compliant. But I walk every single parking space in the city, and a bunch of spaces disappeared. So that fix is going to be going hopefully through City Council soon. But really, looking at your spaces, and you may have the number, but are they closest to a curb cut, or are they in areas that have access to businesses? So you may need to, in the downtown core, you might need to spread them out a little more. But hitting those numbers, I think 2% above a certain number that you need. And then recreation areas. Last year, we did add onto the parking schedule the accessible parking spaces. So that allows the parking management to find people who are parking in those spaces. But kind of beyond that, in the recreation plan, there's a lot of things that are identified, such as making trails that are and signage that's for people who are blind or low vision, making soft surface trails, and then picnic areas. A lot of picnic areas they're on concrete, but you have to go through dirt and kind of around different things to get to them, or the long height, or there's no place for a wheelchair. And then we've seen a lot of people. The other action item was enforcement policies for people parking on sidewalks. It seems like there's only been a few repeat offenders, but there's enforcement. But again, if the user is having to report that, then they don't have access in the moment. So how can we start that? So some of that might be starting a conversation with those owners. But there's also some built environment things where they're getting deliveries, and the only place they reasonably could take the delivery is on the sidewalk. So a lot of these things are in process. I think only bringing the ADA coordinator really into this office is fully complete. But some of these I'm learning just takes a little more time, and I think some grant opportunities to kind of make those projects happen. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them later.
Thanks, Keith. And if you do have a link to your transition plan, is it available on the website? I know I have a copy.
I can send a link, yeah.
Okay, great. So next we have Andrew Kilduff. Andrew, are you on? I see your name.
Yes, my camera's going to take a moment, but I am here.
Okay, great. So Andrew designed the Belchertown Trail and has been gracious enough to join us today from New York City. And so Go ahead, Andrew, whenever you're ready.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I think what I'm going to do as I figure out my camera situation, Doug, would you like to introduce the premise of the project, since you're the inception is in your court, and then I can follow through with specific design details?
Yeah. The whole concept is sort of this coming together of a bunch of different things. It's partly the redevelopment of the former state school campus. There he is. He's much better looking than I am. I could shut off my camera. But rebuilding the old former state school campus, which is happening sort of over here. And then over here, we have the town schools and a big town project, a citizen project was Jessica's Boundless Playground. And you should look that up if you don't know it yet, which was a mother's effort of love for her daughter who had been handicapped and died young. And so they were instrumental in also spurring the idea. So the whole thing came out, we have this sort of eutrophying pond, which is an incredible wildlife area right there next to the former state school and across the street from the playground in the schools. And it was kind of overgrown with invasive plants and scruffy looking, and we decided to spiff it up. And I thought, boy, wouldn't it be great to have a trail around the pond? You know, going all the way around the pond is going to be difficult with an accessible trail, but ideally we get at least an improved trail that far. But for now, the first part was to do this fully accessible sensory trail, kind of connecting the playground back to a recreation area with some wildlife viewing areas and some interpretive signage and things like that. So it's kind of bringing things together. We're right there next to Jess's senior center. So that's basically next door, and Christopher Heights Assisted Living is right there also. So we have lots of really interesting, cool ideas. And so we were fortunate to have Andrew kind of trip our way when he was a Conway school student. And he got this thing going, and I said, here's a smart guy. I'm going to let him finish it and actually make it succeed. So that's when I shut up and disappear.
Awesome. Thank you for the perfect transition, Doug. So I'm going to selectively outline the timeline, the current state of the project, and then frame a particular area of design consideration so that it relates to the conversation at hand, which is specifically accessibility on a trail that is intended to reach as broad a user base as possible, and what specific design considerations or like reconciling we worked with over the past couple of years to make that happen. So what we're working with now is essentially a 5-year timescale, mostly to do with funding. So I think has been echoed with other projects, disaster planning, feasibility planning, architectural timelines, all of that is the progress in which these projects evolve, and how over the years you can take in stakeholder input, work with different design considerations, experience and see the context and the landscape specifically change over time, so you actually have a better sense as to what you're putting in the ground and how that ultimately is going to be experienced by the users who engage with it. And what Doug was mentioning earlier on is this project conceptually was initially a student-based project that I worked on with another classmate, Amanda, when I was a student at the Conway School in 2016 and 2017. After which I took it on as part of a design company that I started, and it became sort of like our initial flagship project in Pioneer Valley, and has been one that we've carried for some years now. And what we'll actually end up doing is wrapping the project up this week, and we have our opening for the trail on Monday of next week. So there's still a few tweaks here and there. We're working on like the final surface to make sure it's smoothed out per the considerations of wheelchair access and other appropriate guidelines so that we're matching our initial design, tweaking some of the last elements of the sensory components, which I'll outline in detail, and really looking at what the public is seeing already based on their use and what the public will begin to experience once it's more publicly available. And within sort of like this 5-year time frame, beginning in 2017, what we really wanted to try out is taking a pretty novel and wild concept that has been replicated in other places and working it into the specific context of Belchertown, and even more specifically where it is in Belchertown. So within about a 2,000-foot perimeter of the project center, the senior center, the recreation department, an assisted living facility, and 3 of Belchertown's public schools and a public recreational facility are all in that scope. And what we wanted to do is basically take in what we could accomplish on the ground in a very small space, reach out to each of those stakeholders, and then see what boundaries we need to push. And one interesting thematic element that came into play here was the location of this trail project being on the grounds of a former state school. And without going into the depths of the history of the state school in Belchertown specifically, one of the things that I wanted to work on was taking the legacy of that institution and trying to see what we could do on this space in looking forward and addressing the issues that institution had created during its tenure and ultimately its closure into the 90s, which was a decline in the condition and the acceptance of individuals with disabilities or cognitive limitations or sensory limitations. And does this project potentially open up a new chapter where we're looking at inclusivity, specifically in the space where inclusivity was eventually eroded? Where we stand now is a construction and phase design wrapping up, and where we plan to go is with the extension of this initial sensory trail section, which is about half a mile long, and doubling or tripling it in size. So from a fanfare perspective, we're trying to build the longest sensory trail in the Commonwealth. And if I have my way with it, I will build the longest sensory trail in the United States in Belchertown. The point being is we're taking each section and we're improving on our design considerations so that we're actually reaching out to even more audiences and community groups who will use it for specific reasons. I'm just going to run through kind of like the visual makeup of this so that the following slides are going to be related to what you see on the ground, but will be more design specific. The Lake Wallace area was a relatively unkempt space, if we want to call it that. It borders about a 40-acre kind of like mixed wetland aquatic environment, and had been overgrown. And so the trail here is really going in place of what were informal walking spaces and turning something more formal, more usable for the community. Our construction was based off an ADA guideline principle and an ABA guideline principle. What we are working with is specific alterations given the landscape context to allow us to give some like flexibility to the design, but ultimately like staying within those guidelines. The reason we can work with flexibility is that we're in a position where, as not an architectural feature, we have a little bit of leeway in how we interpret that, except that we're always aiming for those guidelines to be a basis of our design. And what we have is a very gently sloped or gently graded trail with a very deep and robust trail base that sheds water, has high sight lines and visibility, is meandering, and is largely open and visible at long distances. In addition, there are numerous structures which apply those same guidelines. So gently sloped, accessible from a wheelchair, and even in some cases, larger motorized scooters, wide with resting spaces and turnoffs, and appropriate guide rails and bumpers so that we can actually get into areas we want people to experience without sacrificing those viewpoints. And what we ended up learning as we designed these, all of these structures were based on structural engineering drawings, is that we actually had some flexibility in how large we wanted to make them. We ended up making very large boardwalks, which not only allow for direct access, but actually create situations in where There's specific mobility uses, particularly those individuals who want to use it who are in wheelchairs or scooters, where they can actually move around and create viewpoints, which is unusual for boardwalks. Usually it's a very unidirectional experience, in and out, or like down a route and back. And also it gives us the flexibility to really bring people to areas that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. The other big part of this, and the reason we call a sensory trail, and I'll break out that statement in a moment, is we decided that one of the user groups that we wanted most to engage were those who had direct sensory limitations, either auditory or visual, and who had cognitive limitations. So there's a component that runs the entirety of the length of the trail, which for all intents and purposes, I call a rope guide. It's actually stainless steel aircraft cable because that will last 50 years. This allows someone to train themselves along the direct length of the path, and it creates a platform by which we can integrate components that act as intellectual or like sensory cues, which correspond to a whole suite of educational signs. The idea being someone can walk themselves through this landscape and, in a sense, visually create an experience of what they're walking around if they can't even see it. And they can begin to correlate sounds and smells and textures as part of that image that they're making. And we enhance that by these features, which are tactile components that indicate what's by you or what's coming up, and signs that are visually engaging in that they tell you where you are, what objects generally may be there, and also are all legible in Braille. And this follows too with some of the educational signs that we worked with, and also brings us to access and controllability of the site, which is taking areas that are generally unused for parking and reframing them in a way in which van accessibility and direct engagement for wheelchairs from parking lot to the endpoints of the trail are made seamlessly. If I were to take all those sign points and the sensory trail, and I want to put it out in a schematic, this is what I end up with. These are all of the points throughout the entirety of the trail that have different cues or points of interest or changes in texture or changes in tactile or changes in direction that begin to make clear that illustration of what the landscape is for anyone who's using it, whether they can see it or not, whether they can hear it or not, whether they have a degree of understanding or a different degree of experiential learning. And the idea really here is corresponding this overall with an educational program so that someone's learning as they're experiencing. And that learning is really based on what they feel comfortable and are capable of experiencing directly and building that image for themselves. All of the signs are built off premises for ADA and visual accessibility. This was a fun experiment because when you're making educational signs, your presumption is that you're making them for someone who can see them and read them in their fullest comprehension. And what we wanted to do is try the opposite. We wanted to say, what are we going to express here in simplest form that can reach the most people and build up from that? And what about the design of these signs is going to enable us to keep laddering in a way that we're continuing to reach all those people while trying to tell a very complex story about this place? And what we start with is principles around contrast and lettering, typology and typography, text size, visual placement, height placement, distances between signs, all of these factors which give us an ability to express the program of the place while remaining conscious and complete in our ability to engage this many different stakeholders who we expect to use the trail. If we're to take that in a physical sense, we use the tactile components. These are all interpolated from a series of other trails around the country, which use these in different ways. I've seen regular nautical rope. We've seen granite blocks. There's really no universal principle applied here for sensory trails. So what we did is we took for lack of better words, an average of the two. Then we took the context of the place and we worked with a design that made most sense for us and for this trail specifically. And what we end up with are two different types of signs, as I pointed out in the images before. We have these high contrast braille signs, which combined create that image of the place. And we also have 9 of these learning stations, which were co-developed by teachers from Belchertown Public Schools and the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which give that range of experiential learning, whether it's a undergraduate level science class or geology class who's coming here to learn about reglaciation and soil cores, or it's the kindergartners who just want to touch worms, or it's folks from Riverside Industries who are working through their own programmatic experience and learning about outdoor living and outdoor environment. And they're just taking elements or pieces of this experience over time to build a sense of where they are and how this environment works. And these signs combined are distributed and relate to one another and create another layer of programmatic experience here, which is about sensory, environment, ecology, and bringing everyone together to learn about a specific place and learn about it in their own ways specifically. And to qualify that earlier graphic I provided, the layout ends up looking like this, where the signs are very strategically placed. They relate to things that people can see and hear and touch and smell. And they create a relationship between you and that place, so that the original concept of a sensory trail in its very minimal form is just an ADA pathway that's smooth and has a rope guide. And we said we could take this and max it to the nth degree, and we can use this as a precedent for sensory trail design elsewhere in the Commonwealth, and possibly think about this as serving as precedent for sensory trail writ large. And what the goal is moving forward is beginning to really take the direct experiences of users after the trails open next week, and beginning to work with some of the apparent tweaks and improvements we expect to make, including the addition of more elements that are tactile guidance or more signs, or even evolving what the signs say themselves. So that's the breakdown I wanted to give. In a general sense, what was interesting about this project is how much reconciling you end up taking as a designer, because there are very practical ways to go about implementing ABA, and then how much flexibility do you have in all of the nuances to make something that looks like it fits in the landscape and is aesthetically pleasing and is even comfortable to use. And one example of the last part that I'll make mention here is I had noted that a lot of sensory trails use nautical rope. Nautical rope is interesting when it's woolen. It has a textual experience to it, and I don't want to say it's soothing, but it's recognizable and familiar. When you use synthetic nautical roping, it's smooth and almost abrasive. What we used is aircraft cable that was coated in plastic. And this is very light to the touch, and it doesn't actually kind of rely on someone grasping. It's actually meant for them to just rest their hand on it and glide smoothly. And it doesn't get cold in the winter, and it doesn't ice over, and it dries out very quickly. So it's just fun little details like that, and the experience and the feedback that we received when designing this project that allowed us to think about where these boundaries we wanted to push actually were. And that concludes my spiel.
Thanks, Andrew. So we have, that was really great. And part of the reason I thought of the sensory trail is when you Google sensory trails, there are sensory trails a lot in Australia for people with dementia, because it's a helpful way for people to sort of spur memories and that kind of thing. So that gets into the dementia element as well. So we have time for questions, and I'm happy to share more resources, but I want to open it up for questions now. So feel free to raise your hand or unmute And I can't see everyone at once, so if I don't see you, please go ahead and unmute.
Can I make a comment on the Belchertown Trail? Okay, I help coordinate the newly revived senior center walking group there, and we've had 2 of our walks on the trail, and I have to say it's really, the signage and everything has really enhanced the experience of the people who participate in the walking group. The other thing that I think plays into the accessibility of the overall site is that in Belchertown, the created a sidewalk all along 202 down Route 202 down to the senior center from the center of town, which enhances walking accessibility to the general area, which I think is an important factor in terms of making it accessible to people who don't necessarily want to drive, and it enhances the walking experience, if you will. So I have to say it's just been a wonderful resource for the community.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's good to hear that from a user. I'll have to say that I took my 93-year-old mother out there a couple of weeks ago, and we walked out onto the dock, and there was a woman who was out on the dock. She's certainly older than I am, but not my mother's age. And she had a couple of walking sticks, and she looked over at me, and she had no idea who I am, and said, "This is the best thing this town's ever done." So that felt pretty good. See, Mom, I'm not a total burner. You said I'd be nothing, but the other thing is that this really kind of is the core of sort of what we envision as a greater townwide trail system connecting into the sidewalks. And as the state school, now called Carriage Grove, builds out with fully accessible sidewalks, this will blend right into those sidewalks. And then it'll connect to other trails, the snowmobile trail, the New England Trail, the rail trail, and such, so that it really, I think, promotes moving your legs, getting out and staying healthy and getting exercise as much as you can.
Definitely.
And that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, definitely.
James, did you have a question?
Yeah, just Becky, thanks to you and everybody that's been working on all this stuff, the presenters and Team Belchertown and Northampton and everybody. This is like, when people ask what an age and dementia friendly community is, this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about, having buildings and public spaces and trails and everything else be inclusive of those folks. So just a couple notes of things that we have going on, that I'm on a work group with the Mass Council on Aging Association, of a state commission on Alzheimer's and related dementias. We're coming up with a dementia-friendly design considerations guide. And it's not exact standards or things that, planners would use or architects would use, but it's things to think about and incorporate sort of in slightly broader strokes. But they were mentioned, by Chris and others about, dark floor mats being kind of coming up, registering as holes for people living with dementia and things like that, and having entrances and signage be clear, and all the stuff that everybody's been talking about throughout this. So there's that, but also this trails discussion sort of coincides with something we're trying to do, which is work with a program called Mass Trails. And you might be aware of it, but it's a regular state funding opportunity to support and connect the state's trail network. What we're trying to do is incorporate age and dementia friendly concepts into that. So between Doug and Andrew and everybody else and John that's working on this stuff, we'd love to bring you into that discussion at some point if it's of interest, that maybe we could get some funding support or some sort of bonus points for existing funding opportunities. And that's what we try to do, is put this lens on sort of existing funding opportunities to get the state to think about supporting, trails and spaces and complete streets and everything else for older people and people living with dementia. So I think my contact info is in the chat, but just reach out to me if any of that's of interest. And thank you again for all of this.
Thanks, James. Any other questions, or does anyone else have anything to share about some work going on in your communities? Linda, I see your hand.
First of all, can you hear me all right? First of all, I just want to thank Andrew. When I was 16 years old, I volunteered at Belchertown. And for you to create this reuse, this incredible reuse system of bringing people out and making it accessible, it reaches my heart. I just wanted to thank you, Andrew. I have stories from 16, and this erases some of the negative stuff that I experienced at a really young age. Andrew, it's awesome. The other thing I was wanting to ask about universal design. Basically, it just looked beautiful, the safety aspects and the accessibility aspects. But does it ever consider to encourage a communication? If you have separate benches and you have them very wide spread out, I mean, is there any thought of creating like kind of the benches together or something that doesn't take away from the accessibility so people can talk, because isolation is one of the issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So definitely, communication and creating spaces that are kind of accidental interaction potential, to have spaces where it kind of have dual purpose, like the benches, for instance. I think the idea there is that they are designed there for rest, but they're designed in such a way where multiple people can kind of hang out there and, have accidental interactions with folks that are passing by, or, if multiple people want to take breaks. So that's definitely a consideration and can be, furthered in our design, for sure. But it's definitely a good point. It goes back to the whole flexibility in use of the universal design principles, and that, those benches could be used for, rest and taking a break, but also be used for, a social setting as well. So I think that's a good point, and something, we could definitely continue to drive home on in the design side.
Thank you. Thanks. I see Keith and then Melissa.
Andrew or Doug, do you have the information for the open house, I guess, or the opening of the trail? If you could share that, would be great. And then corollary to that, I noticed on the website it says donate and then wait for future. If you could have the donate ready for the open house, because I think people might be really interested in this and want to give them money right away. Like, I feel like Fry from Futurama right now, like, take my money.
Yes, I will take your money. I will take everyone's money. Yeah, we're first question. Yeah, we're just working out like the functional technicalities of donations. So I think that's probably, I would presume on Monday when I'm there, people might be making that offer. So I think that's actually a Doug and like town accounting question. Doug, I'm just going to put that in your responsibility basket. And yes, Becky, if you want, I can just send you we have like a opening pamphlet, if you will, or printout. So I can just email it to you and you can forward it to the email list that's on the event.
Sure.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Thanks. Melissa.
I hope it's not too presumptuous of me as a panelist to ask a question, but I have a quick question for Chris. And Chris, I wanted to know how you deal with tensions around universal design, because I love your building. It's great. And I sincerely mean that. I don't do that often. I don't say something is totally great often, and compliance is great. But what I wanted to know is how you deal with tensions like the requirement for truncated domes, which are bumps, basically the bumps that people see so you can detect it with a cane, versus having a smooth surface, which is preferable for people with mobility disabilities, and how that plays in and how you deal with it. Because I struggle with it myself. You're on mute, Chris.
Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
that better? Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conundrum because, you know, some of the stuff is directly at odds with some of the principles that we have. And, you know, I guess it's a lot of the times it's in discussion with the client and the specific project that we're working on, and, you know, the specific case that we just, you know, we have to make a determination as to what's the challenge and what are we trying to accomplish. And a lot of the times there are, you know, sacrifices that you have to make because, you know, like you said, the smooth surface and, you know, trip hazards is very important, but then you also have to make it available for others to be able to have that tactile, you know, response and, you know, understand where you are in the landscape. So, you know, you try to be really specific with where you unleash those strategies, and not, you know, try to be too overwhelming with strategies, but, you know, be really specific and use them where you get the most bang for the buck, essentially. But, you know, it's a great point. It's something that we struggle with all the time is, you know, some of the components just are at odds with each other. And it's just, you know, a matter of, you know, understanding what the challenge is and what are we trying to accomplish? What's the center trying to accomplish? What's the space trying to accomplish? And just make the best determining factor for that particular item at hand. So I know it's not a great answer, but that stuff comes up all the time. And, you know, we struggle with it quite a bit, but, you know, we do the best that we can and making the right decisions for the center specifically.
Thank you. I agree. And there is no right answer. I was hoping there might be some magic you had, but, you know, but I agree. Thank you so much.
No, I don't have that fairy dust that I can sprinkle on things and make it all work, unfortunately.
Any other questions? I do have a question for Melissa. So I know there are some cities and towns that don't have ADA transition plans. Is there a liability or, you know, what makes cities have to have ADA transition plans, I guess is the question. And what, if you know of any good funding sources that they can use to develop those?
Sadly, no, I don't know of good funding sources. I'll answer the last question first. We still need to put it in your budgets. When you request a CDBG grant or any kind of grant, put access into your budgets automatically, including for sign language interpreters, including for all of the other things you need, the soft things that aren't brick and mortar. But also what I wanted to say, the consequences of not having a transition plan are several. First of all, someone can file a complaint. If you're lucky, they'll file an administrative complaint. You want people to file administrative complaints because those are resolved easily, relatively easily, and more quickly. They can file a complaint with the Department of Justice. So they can file an internal grievance. They can file an administrative complaint with the Department of Justice. That can be lots of headaches for you. That can be expensive. That can be time consuming, or they can sue you. And whether you win or lose a lawsuit is expensive, and it creates will that you don't want to create in your communities. I know Northampton doesn't want to create that kind of will. So, and also the Department of Justice, honestly, enforcement is spotty, but they pick municipalities to come into if they've gotten complaints, and even if they haven't, and they come in and they make the transition plan for you. And you'd much rather do it yourself than have an outside party do it. Not to say they do it unfairly or anything like that. So those are some of the kinds of consequences. There's also the legal exposure where somebody trips where there isn't a curb cut that they're supposed to be, and they get injured. Then you have exposure on that front. Does that make sense? And that's a mushy answer, but there's fines that can be involved with it, but it's not a specific clear-cut thing, but it's enforced by the DOJ.
Thank you. B, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing? I see you just put a note in the chat there.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Beatrice Dewberry, the Community Building and Engagement Manager with Wayfinders. And we have a community-based advocates group. I'm going to just come on camera. And most of the residents who comprise that group are older adults who live in the Mason Square area, which is 4 conjoined neighborhoods in Springfield. And past year or longer, they've been doing a lot of advocacy around implementing an ADA transition plan in the city. So we've had conversations with our DPW director, Andy Krar. We've spoken directly and had our city's disability commissioner, I'm not sure what his full title is, come to community meetings. But we really just haven't received, it's not based. Often the barrier has been the financial aspects of going forward with a plan, and then the concern about implementation of findings that would come out of that. But the residents are very vocal. They've been very vocal around lighting concerns. We do walk audits in neighborhoods, which are then submitted to the city, and they have been used to sort of inform some design decisions. But right now, any support or advice that anyone on this platform could provide would be useful. I think there's a lot of frustration on the part of our residents, in particular, our older adult residents, who are like, what do we do to convince the city this is needed? And, you know, and it's worth the funding that would go into it.
Thanks, Pete. Melissa, you want to answer that, and then I'll go to Tracy.
Sure. And I'll try and lower my hand, as it's complicated for me to walk and chew gum like this. Anyway, so what I wanted to say is that you can file a complaint, like I said. Sounds like you have a good community group, which is good. What I remind people is that the ADA is 32 years old. And when Department of Justice comes in, they're not going to say, is it in the budget of your city this year? They're going to say, has it been in the budget of your city for the last 32 years? And they're going to look at an attempt, if an attempt has been made. They have a transition plan requirement, which is about the architecture, the physical buildings, and the structures. They also have a plan for self-evaluation, where they have to look at, do you provide equally effective communication? Is your website, your town website, accessible? Are materials available in print and alternative format? Are there sign language interpreters and meetings when required to be? Are they doing those things? Are they audio describing things when they're supposed to be? So it's a whole lot more than just architecture. Lighting isn't a requirement in the ADA, and congratulations to you for doing it. It should be. They didn't care what I said about the ADA when they asked me 32 years ago, and I didn't think it would ever pass anyway. But so I'm just the messenger. There's lots to do. You have my contact information. Feel free to email me, and I think it's got my phone number in it. And feel free to call me anytime, and I can give you some tips. I'm a grassroots advocate myself, and I've been doing this for a very long time, and community is what does it, but it's not an option. It's not a, we don't have it in our budget. It's not a, we can't do it because we're afraid what we might find out. You really don't want them saying that and quoting that, in a complaint or something. So just let them know, and sometimes you go with them the law on the piece of paper and say, I'm here, you have to do this. And they might not know that, they might not understand that. And it's not the fault of the person there now. It just got kind of passed down, and the person might not have even been alive when this went into effect. So it's looking at that from the perspective of where they are now. I believe in meeting people where they're at, but at the same time, they have to be held accountable for the fact that this obligation has been there for 32 years. So feel free to contact me anytime. I'll probably forget to copy your email, so feel free to get in touch. Thank
Absolutely. I'd love if you could even come to one of our meetings. It's on Zoom. So
I was going to say, don't do it in person, but I will do Zoom. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we do Zoom, and I would love to have you come. I think your voice would be so inspirational.
Sure. No problem. No problem. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Tracy, quick question, and then I do want to move on a little bit.
My quick question was just about lighting, because Beatrice had brought it up. So I live in Amherst, and there was a proposal that came to our town council here a few weeks ago. It was focused on dark skies and light pollution. And it focused on actually taking streetlights out of a lot of neighborhoods and completely eliminating them, basically. And I'm a transportation safety person, and I was concerned about how those dark sky goals, as laudable as they are, like how they could adversely impact the safety and accessibility, and also Amherst's goal to be a more age-friendly community. And so I was just sort of looking at looking to find guidance on that. But I think that the proposal went too far in terms of the areas of town that it would like to be like completely dark. And Amherst has a population, both an aging population, but also just a UMass population that's like quite walking dependent and transit dependent, which also involves a lot of walking, right? And in the winter, it gets dark at 4 and things, and we have a lot of streets with no sidewalks and things like that. So I was just concerned about the adverse impacts, but if people had specific information on guidelines for like age-friendly communities and things relating to lighting, that would be helpful.
This is Melissa. I don't have any specific guidelines if I can just jump in, but what jumps out at me is that is unsafe, that is specifically unsafe and unfriendly for women. I was a young woman walking around those streets at night and was fearful. And if it was dark, I was not able to go out. I was imprisoned in a closed space if there wasn't adequate light. So that's just a whole other attitude. So it's age friendly across the entire age spectrum.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And I know there are, lighting that can be downward facing, so it doesn't have to create, such a light impact on the skies. So that might be something to look into also.
Yeah, that was something I was going to bring up, Becky, was, it confuses me that they would want to just eliminate lighting altogether. It would make sense if they were talking about replacing the fixtures, because there are numerous dark skies compliant fixtures. We specify them all the time on buildings. But on site, walkways and parking lots, I'm sure they have similar fixtures that are compliant that, would comply with those, strict requirements, but would give you the safety that you would need. And I totally agree. I think that is a, not a holistic view to just remove the lighting altogether. But yeah, you might want to, as Becky said, you might want to look into how dark skies compliant fixtures would affect, the plans to just remove the fixtures altogether.
Thanks. If you have any more questions, I will be sending out contact information for everyone. I want to talk a little bit about regional designation, because we're going to be moving forward with that. So let me just share my screen. Oops. And I'm sorry, we're going a little into the open period, but I just want to get some information out to all of you. Let's see. Okay. So anyone who's been to these meetings, the last few meetings I've been talking about regional designation, but we're going to move forward with it. We were sort of trying to decide whether it would involve letters of support, and James provided a few examples. What we decided on was a resolution that we'll be sending out a cover letter from our executive director with this resolution that we're asking community leaders to adopt. We will CC councils on aging and anyone else who wants to be CC'd on this, because it may take some, advocacy at a select board meeting or talking to your mayor about why this is important. It's a fairly open-ended resolution. It just says, we're supporting this age-friendly effort in the region. And once we'll give a couple months for getting those resolutions adopted and then submit an application to AARP and Dementia-Friendly Massachusetts for regional designation of both Hampshire and Hampden counties as age and dementia-friendly. So currently, this is the map that I have. It may be a little outdated. The lighter red hearts are communities that are age-friendly, and actually I need to update Munson, that were without submitting a report yet. The red hearts have submitted a community assessment and action plan, and the purple stars are the dementia-friendly communities. So what it would do is it make the whole region age and dementia-friendly. We will continue to assist individual communities with community assessments and action plans, if that's a route you want to take. As I have done this with several communities in the last couple of years, I found a lot of overlap, a lot of similar recommendations. And also, as we've done these regional meetings, I think there are several areas where we could collaborate as a region or recommend some regional projects. So I'm proposing in this fiscal year, we have one more year of the Tufts Health, or now 0.32 Health funding, to do sort of a high-level regional assessment. So look at all the communities that have already completed assessments, and also to, if there are other communities that want to join this process this year, and this might make sense for some of the smaller towns, we can do a survey at a regional level for communities that haven't already done surveys. We can do them online and printed, and we can do some listening sessions in your community. I've only heard from a couple so far, and of the ones I've reached out to, but please let me know if you want to be part of this regional sort of assessment process. And I'm also looking for a regional advisory committee. So let me know if you would like to join that. What I'm thinking is we would meet in between the quarterly meetings. We might discuss a few things at the quarterly meetings, but it's really to sort of get into the nuts and bolts of, if we do a regional survey, what would that look like? And just sort of as a review and oversight committee for this project. So then we develop a regional action plan, and then that could include local action plans for communities that wish to conduct the survey and a listening session. And we can have sort of a checklist of, these are the actions that our community wants to take in the next 5 years, and do it that way. Again, I'll send these resources out. These were resources for outdoor spaces and trails and stuff, but I'll send these out after the meeting. So that's what I had on regional designation. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to share too, because I know James will mention this. Community compacts. This is a source of funding that is really open to every community in the state. And there's a map which I can share. I will share later. There's a link to this map, and if you click on a city or town, it'll say how many years of the compact and what your best practices are. The application opened in August 15th, and it's a rolling application. So municipalities that didn't apply in FY22 are eligible to apply. You have to have finished any prior compact initiative prior initiatives that were funded by the compact. There's, again, no deadline. The funding's available until it runs out. You can do a regional application. So several communities would choose the same best practice and click on regionalization. And every community leader should have received a letter from Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, which has a passcode. And so that allows you to get into the application. It's a very simple application. We're doing a project currently with Northampton to do a regulatory review. It's mainly, I think, for planning and some implementation. I'm not sure if it funds like capital type projects, but it does fund planning and some implementation involving policy and that kind of thing. And James, I don't know if you know if it would fund an ADA transition plan. I'm not sure if it would be enough funding.
Yeah, so I'm aware that other communities have actually had. So from the community compact program, there are 100+ best practices that communities can choose from, and even those are pretty flexible. And it all depends on what community leaders want to do, and the administration will say, that sounds good, you're the local expert, here's the money in most cases. So there's age and dementia friendly best practices, which again are flexible. I put those in the chat. But for ADA, I know that at least one community, Waltham, did an ADA accessibility best practice. Others, I'm assuming others have done an ADA best practice, but there are, suffice to say, all kinds of things that communities can do. So the funding can support the process. It can support local projects. It can support the assessment and action planning. There's all kinds of things, but the funding's available, starting about a week or so ago, as Becky said, until it runs out. So, if you're tied in with your city or town leadership, this is a great opportunity to pull some funding together and to get something going, and to support local or regional work. And I'm happy to chat about it if anybody has questions.
Thanks. At this point, I welcome anyone who wants to stay and talk more about regional designation, or if anyone has questions right now. As I said, the letter will go out probably next week. So please support the resolution if you can. Also, I'm happy to help to send it out if anyone wants to review it quickly. And I didn't share it here, but I can send that out too. So anyone have any questions or want to talk more about that? And then we're in the sort of half hour I left for a roundtable discussion. So also if anyone wants to jump off at this point too, that's fine. Let's see. I don't see any hands. We can also talk about if you want to open it up to any other questions or concerns about the age-friendly work that you're doing in your community. So I don't see any questions. Lee, it's nice to see you on there. Oh, Chad, do you have a question? Oh, you're muted.
Sure. It just came up as you went over the compact at the end of our meetings today. And I was thinking of what I saw the word action plan. So I'm wondering if after our listening sessions are completed, is there a plan that pulls together the surveys and the listening sessions and all that into a plan for our town or for our town?
Yes. Yeah, that's what we'll be doing after. There's a couple more forums scheduled in Amherst.
Yeah.
We've completed the survey. So yes, we are working on that now. And actually the next working group meeting's on Monday, and I'll be presenting some draft recommendations. But yeah, that's definitely something that's coming out of this process.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So any thoughts on the resolution process? Do you want to see the resolution? Do you think your town leaders will be supportive of it? I can open it up now.
Becky, remind me how many communities are in the region? Is it 42?
43.
43, I was close. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if every community is going to sign on to it, but I think the point of this is there are older adults in every community. So every community is going to benefit from this. It's just whether or not there's going to be some local commitment to kind of pile on maybe some additional town strategies. And the resolution's right there. But either way, I think this is about local and regional sort of collaboration to support different levels and types of projects and systems and ways to address gaps, but also talk about the stuff that was shared today, all the great things that are happening in the region, and allow other communities to maybe copy or borrow certain bits and pieces from that stuff, whether it's Chris and the senior center design, or the sensory trail, or universal design standards, or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of benefit that can come from this, and it doesn't have to mean every community gets it, but the more communities that sign on, I think the more sustainable and the stronger it will be, of course. Yeah, and part of this is as we've been developing these community assessment and action plans, there's sometimes simultaneous processes where communities are developing their master plans. And I think the goal is really to get these recommendations in the master plan, because that's really the town's, blueprint for the future.
And I've been successful in doing that in a few towns, but this is really sort of committing us to look at age and dementia friendly aspects of master plans as well. Anything that we're involved with, open space and recreation plans, housing production plans, it's just, making sure older adults are a consideration. And they usually are, but actually involving them in the process as well as
there's so much going on for school buildings and libraries and all kinds of things that are constantly being designed and built in communities, and it's great to put the age and dementia friendly lens on that work to say how can you create intergenerational spaces or just things that are generally supportive of people or for people of all ages in the community. So lots of opportunity.
Okay, well, I think not seeing any more questions or Lee, how are things going in Chicopee? Is this something you think your mayor would sign on to?
I don't think we'd have a challenge having the council and the mayor sign on to it. I'll have to do a little bit of legwork with Sherry over at the senior center, but I don't think we'd have an issue here.
Okay. Yeah, and I worked with Chicopee, one of my first communities I worked with, so I didn't really know. I was a little early in the process, but yeah, I definitely like to work with you more on that, enhancing that plan that we developed too. Kat.
Yeah, Beck, sorry, Kat, I don't want to cut you off.
Oh, I'm just I'm very much a beginner here, and I just really need a step-by-step process of how best to move forward to get both the COA and the community on hand. And I need all the information I can get. So I'm looking forward to tapping into more of Becky and James' help in the future, and who else would be of help as well. So go ahead, Pat.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's actually kind of a cool time to give a shout out to Mayor Koss, who was good enough to take a last minute meeting with Lee and a bunch of other people. And James was coming through town and he made his pitch. And at the end, the mayor was nodding his head and was like, I like this idea. I think the region should do it together. And I think PVPC is in charge. So fond memory. And it's crazy that, all this funding and kind of momentum. So I think the regional designation is really kind of the natural next step, but I'm excited to be a part of it and to the little part that I play here. And I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that was my second week at PVPC and I had to do an application in a week. So that's where we started.
Sorry about that, Becky, but thank you, Pat. For, you may think it's small, but it's that spark that kicks it all off. So it's much appreciated.
Thanks.
I heard a lot of dead air after you asked the question, are we ready to support this? And I don't know if I'm the only one who was silent for this reason, but I am totally behind the populations that Melissa, no one else really mentioned, those whole wide swath of populations. But I know that grants usually have strings attached. So I'm not sure if this is about grant money that would come down, or, maybe like the last speaker, I don't have enough information.
Yeah, and the cover letter might cover it a little more. I guess, the idea of being an age-friendly region, as people get older, they're more likely to have mobility issues or other, disabling conditions such as vision and hearing impairment. So I think that, that will benefit that population. It's an inclusive process, as Melissa pointed out. You really have to look at every sector of the community, and we do that during the age and dementia-friendly assessment process. So I think that will help. I think developing a regional sort of overview and assessment, we can look at recommendations for regional projects, like transportation comes to mind, areas that aren't currently served by local council on aging vans or PBTA, you know, what types of transportation needs are out there. We've talked about or looked at, you know, developing a regional trail map. Can we add like trails that are accessible, you know, different levels of difficulty for different ages and abilities. So that's another regional type project. So I think, and then of course, housing is an issue everywhere and has been looked at on a regional level, but it's another thing that we might want to look into further. Go ahead, James.
Just, you know, I know I'm pitching this a lot right now and I don't need to, but with a lot of local control dynamic in Massachusetts, we see other parts of the country designating or committing to the age and dementia friendly process, you know, on a county level. And it doesn't always work, or it doesn't usually work in Massachusetts that way. So the regional planning agencies, you know, with PVPC being a leader in this, has been just a huge step in getting communities to work together on a different level and showing communities that they're supported in this work, and just bringing different networks together to address things like transportation and housing and different policy initiatives on a local level. So, yeah, this is the way things are going anyway in Massachusetts and across the country, just because it's more sustainable. It creates more of sort of a culture change of embedding age and dementia friendly in different local and regional processes. So we're excited for this. And if folks have questions, you know, again, I'm available and supporting Becky. And Becky, I don't know if it goes without saying, but I'm happy to be on that advisory group if you need me. You know, appreciate everybody's time as part of this.
Thanks, James. Anything else? And if not, I'm happy to end the meeting 5 minutes early. Give you all 5 minutes. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions, so appreciate you all for coming. And I will be sending out a link to the recording, and we'll also put it on our website. And we'll be sending links to some of the resources that we talked about. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. And yeah, I'll send out the meeting date too. I don't have that right in front of me. All right. See ya.
Thank you.